Negara-negara di Asia Tenggara sangat rentan terhadap dampak perubahan iklim. Karena di wilayah ini, termasuk di Indonesia, itu sering sekali terjadi bencana alam dan bencana yang terjadi akibat aktivitas manusia. Dan tentu saja ini merugikan bukan saja dari sisi lingkungan hidupnya, tapi juga dari sisi sosial dan ekonominya terhadap masyarakat. Akan tetapi pada waktu yang sama, negara-negara di Asia Tenggara termasuk Indonesia sudah berkomitmen untuk nol emisi pada tahun 2050 dan untuk Indonesia pada tahun 2060. Nah, tantangan untuk mencapai nol emisi ini tentu yang harus dilakukan adalah transisi energi ke energi yang bersih, energi yang terbarukan. Dan tentu saja hal ini tidak mudah, apalagi ketergantungan kita terhadap fossil fuel atau BBM dan juga terhadap batu bara itu masih sangat tinggi. Jadi apa yang harus dilakukan bagi negara-negara di Asia Tenggara, khususnya di Indonesia, untuk mencapai targetnya tanpa mengorbankan pertumbuhan ekonominya dan tanpa mengurangi kesejahteraan masyarakatnya. Insight with Desi Anwar kali ini ditemani oleh Direktur Jenderal dari ADB, bagian dari Southeast Asia Department, yaitu Ramesh Subramaniam.
Indonesia menaikkan target pengurangan emisi dari 29 menjadi 31% pada 2030 jika tidak mendapat bantuan internasional. Namun, jika mendapat bantuan internasional, bisa mengurangi sampai 42%. Hal ini sebagai langkah mencapai zero emission pada 2060 mendatang. Target pengurangan emisi ini diungkapkan Menteri Keuangan Sri Mulyani pada Simposium Southeast Asia Development (SEAD) 2023 yang bertema Imaging a Net Zero ASEAN di Nusa Dua Bali. Upaya mencapai target tersebut dilakukan melalui Enhanced Determined Contribution atau EDC dengan pembiayaan yang tidak sedikit, sekitar Rp4 triliun hingga 2030. Dan ini berasal dari investasi publik dan swasta, termasuk bantuan pembiayaan global.
According to the estimation, by biennial estimation, BUR, total climate finance that is required to achieve our NDC is Rp4.002 trillion. I think you don't have any imagination if I put it in rupiah. So I will translate it in US dollar. It's $281 billion until 2030. It was projected to be fulfilled, of course, with public and private investment.
Kegiatan SEAD 2023 bertema Imaging a Net Zero ASEAN diselenggarakan Asian Development Bank dengan Kementerian Keuangan dalam mendiskusikan berbagai upaya menuju netralitas karbon tahun 2060 di kawasan negara-negara Asia Tenggara. Hasil akhir kegiatan simposium ini diharapkan menjadi masukan global dalam rangka menuju netralitas karbon pada 2060 melalui adopsi teknologi serta mempercepat ketersediaan pembiayaan global.
Our focus on today's show is on enabling energy transition in Southeast Asia, particularly in how to reach net zero emission by the year 2050. I have with me Ramesh Subramaniam. He is the Director General for Southeast Asia Department for ADB. Ramesh, good to see you. Welcome to Bali.
Thank you so much, Desi. Thank you for having us.
Yep, and it's great. And you're not a stranger to Indonesia, and we have been in Indonesia. You've worked here for a while. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your stay last time you were here.
I lived in Indonesia from 2003 to 2007, almost 5 years. But it's a country that I've been in love with. In fact, I've been working in Indonesia, on Indonesia from 1997. But I've worked on other countries as well. But Indonesia is one country where I've done, I would say, a fair bit of work.
Yeah.
And fascinating country, lots of things to learn from, lots of areas where we've been able to contribute, I've been able to be part of, whether it's infrastructure in social sectors, and some of probably the most moving parts of my experience have been working after the Indian Ocean tsunami in helping in Banda Aceh, the reconstruction process, Yogyakarta earthquake. All of these things are also, pointers to the climate challenge that we're talking about, right? In terms of how the Indonesia, and then the Palu, the 2018 earthquake and tsunami. But what is amazing about Indonesia for me is the resilience of the people and the economy, the society as a whole, because the democratization process that you've gone through within a span of 25 years, that's actually amazing.
Yeah, and of course when it comes to climate change, even without this climate change, we are most vulnerable. We're in the ring of fire, so we're prone to natural disasters as well as man-made disasters. The climate issue is very much important to Indonesia, especially Indonesia is one of the greatest emitters of carbon, although not so much from the industrial output, but particularly from things like land, burning of peatlands and land conversion and so on and so forth. So first of all, let's look at it in the global context, because climate change is the one thing that unites everybody on this planet. It affects everybody, and the Paris Agreement, and especially the last COP, the governments all over the world they've committed to net zero emission by 2050, particularly in developed countries. And Indonesia herself, we have committed to 2060 to achieve net zero emission. Although Bali, I have to say, Ramesh, I interviewed the governor recently, he committed to for zero carbon neutral by 2045. Now, looking at the planet as a whole, how significant is and how do you see the transition to clean energy, particularly in Southeast Asia, and how does Southeast Asia contribute to the whole climate change question?
The whole carbon footprint or fossil fuel footprint is very large. If you zoom out of Southeast Asia and look at Asia and the Pacific as a whole, the countries in the region contribute or account for more than 50% of the global, more than 50% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and this is huge, clearly. But also, if we put it in context, the developing countries have been in their growth path, development path, with the aspirations, with the middle class growing and so on. If you ask, is that number large, the developing countries would obviously say that no, it is not. And in terms of the impact that is being faced in the developing countries, it is not all because of their action, the countries that have gone through the industrialization process. So the debate is there. So the 50% is there to be taken in context. But if we now come down to ASEAN, that number is 8%.
Wow, that's significantly much lower.
So, or in other words, you can say ASEAN accounts for about 1/5 of Asia's contribution, or 1/10 roughly, or a little bit less than Asia and the Pacific. But in terms of what it means globally as well as for the countries in the region, it's very, very significant. And as we know, in the context of energy transition, there are many distinguishing or defining features. And if we are looking at energy sector, the carbon footprint is very high there because you're looking at a very young fleet of coal-fired power plants. The average age is around 11 to 12 years. And with Indonesia having a concentration of CFPPs, the coal-fired power plants, then it's challenging. It's interesting when we talk about labor, when we talk about youth particularly, young people, we have the concept of a demographic dividend.
Yeah.
But when it comes to young coal plants, it's a liability. So what is it that Indonesia, the other countries in ASEAN, and Asia and Pacific are going to do? So if you view in that context, the numbers that we are looking at are staggering. And obviously, reading from there or taking from there, the investment requirements are also going to be quite significant. But the benefits are going to be quite significant as well. As we've done in our assessments prior to the ETM announcement, or in the publication that we released today on global value chains. But if you are zooming out and looking at in the context of the global uncertainties, then the energy security concerns have been paramount for any country in the world, and particularly for Indonesia as well as the others.
What we can see now is actually, the way that Indonesia has a presidency of the G20, and now is a chair of the ASEAN, and the commitment is there. The commitment is high. For example, Indonesia, by 2030, on the business as usual, plans to reduce up to 32% of their emission, and 42% with international support. Now, at the moment, however, what we have is energy crisis in Europe, for example, fluctuating prices, and also the rise of the natural resources in terms of particularly like coal. I don't see sort of the incentive for countries to actually implement the decarbonization process. Is the appetite still there, do you think, Ramesh? Because we've had 2 years of COVID, and then we have this war in the Ukraine, and it just looks as if all that Paris Agreement spirit has kind of fizzled out a little bit, or am I wrong here?
It's a very complex, set of issues. Indonesia is not new to climate transition. In fact, if you look at ASEAN countries, Indonesia has been a leader. There have been lots of challenges because it's a natural resource-based economy. Biodiversity issues have always been quite significant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some of the examples that you said in terms of factors that contribute to adverse climate change outcomes, there are many, and you've got political economy dimensions, you've got people's dimensions, you've got national versus local dimensions. So it's a very, very complex set of issues. But I was saying that Indonesia is no stranger to climate transition. In fact, in the ADB ecosystem, one of the first climate change programs that we looked at was in Indonesia. And this was 20 years ago. This was in 2003 to be precise. In fact, there was a lot of momentum. We had done a comprehensive study looking at the country as a whole, as well as we had done district level assessments in terms of pollution and climate, in fact, particularly, although the parlance was different. And we had done projects, in fact, in terms of looking at demand side of energy management. On the supply side, things have been obviously more coal-based because of the, the cost advantages. Now, I think, clearly the momentum has been there. The extraneous or external circumstances, which have been quite extenuating, they were unanticipated. Clearly, who knew the Russian invasion would continue for this long, and the knock-on effects on energy. Clearly, the
demand for energy is actually very
going
high.
up, and even countries in Europe in terms of staying off their plans for decarbonization. So all these factors are happening. In our work in the ETM, I can talk about it later in terms of details, but 3 dimensions that we look at broadly when it comes to climate transition, but particularly for energy transition. What is going to be the overall cost of transition? So that is number 1, very important. Obviously, the benefits are there, but what is going to be the
who's going
cost?
to pay for it, obviously?
Correct, and it's the you definitely have a short-term issue, and clearly in any country, short-term considerations do matter. Long-term benefit flows accrue, but they accrue over a period of time. So, what is going to be the cost? Second is security. This is energy security. When it comes to any transition process, there if you're talking at a micro level, you take one coal-fired power plant. If you're decommissioning it, okay, how do you ensure energy security for that community, depending on the size of the coal plant, right? But if you're zooming out and looking at in the context of the global uncertainties, then the energy security concerns have been paramount for any country in the world, and particularly for Indonesia as well as the others. And the third is equity. It's partly related to who pays for it, but it's probably more related to, or we should be focusing more on who will be affected in the process. So here you have people's dimensions coming in. Again, if you look at a micro level or a community level or a district or a province level, what is going to happen to people, who is going to be affected, who's going to gain? There are always going to be winners and losers in this, but who are going to be affected? And how can we guide the transition to be just, and how are we going to guide that process to be affordable? So these two parameters within that equity dimension are going to be important. Again, if we zoom out, as in the case of energy security, once you go from the micro realm to the macro and the global realm, the dimensions become much more complex, and in the same manner in equity, the dimensions become very complex as well. How do who should call the first shots? Who should be going in with the first investments? Or who's going to put the resources? How are the global commitments going to materialize? And so on and so on. Then you have also, how much is the public sector going to pay? How much is the private sector going to foot in terms of the bill, and so on? So this cost, security, and the equity, the people's dimension is going to be very, very important.
Yes, and I think
so in that regard, in that regard, I think while circumstances have been evolving, the commitment is there, quite strong. I think the political will is there, but any country needs to look at a multitude of factors. So in that regard, cup half full, I would say.
So the cup half full, but it's also half empty, right?
The flip side.
So just quickly, the 2050 reasonable or a realistic goal at this time globally, do you think? I mean, given these circumstances?
Yeah,
because,
I think...
Ramesh, from what I hear, the latest report says that whatever we do, the rise in temperature by 1% is inevitable. Correct. In the next decade. Correct. And our global commitment is to keep that level to 1.5% by the end of the century. I mean, that doesn't look like, it should set off alarm bells all over the world, right?
Oh, definitely there are serious concerns. The IPCC, the recent IPCC report, it's yet another stark reminder that the world needs to act. Now, if you globally 2050, is it a realistic target? So clearly developed countries, and globally there is a lot of commitment. There is a lot more willingness, a lot more, I think, awareness as well. Because, in terms of the equity part that I mentioned, almost everyone is talking about climate, right? Yeah. And that is thanks to the whole slew of international initiatives.
Energy companies as a
even energy companies, even fossil fuel based companies are talking about it. In fact, in the ETM context, when we were in the early stages just before COP26 announcement, in fact, we were having difficulty in just finding time to talk to people, including mostly whether it's public coal plants or private coal plants. But I think, in the 2050, I think is certainly realistic. Now, these are aspirational. Some are binding targets, obviously, from any country's credibility point of view. Decision makers, policy makers need to make sure that these are firm commitments, they need to be met. But clearly it is subject to a number of factors, right? In terms of internal as well as external circumstances. How much of the financing will be secure? And what about various issues with regard to bringing in alternative sources of energy, if you're talking about energy, right? But net zero comprises of a lot of other things. What should be done in transport, what should be done in urban, and what we talked about today in the global value chain context. The whole trade ecosystem, the whole industry and the manufacturing ecosystem is huge, what needs to be done there. And you have the urban dimensions, which are very, very significant. Here we have the initiative to build a new capital in Nusantara. Many other cities in developing countries are going through this challenge. How do we make cities livable? So this poses significant issues as well as opportunities. On, is it 2050 or 2045? I think another thing that we are quite, I would say, excited about and positive is that the whole climate debate has led to competition, healthy competition. For example, the governor of Bali is saying that I'm going to do it in 2045. Somebody else will look at it and say, look, I want to make sure that my province, my district is a better investment destination than somebody else's. So I'm going to take steps. So that is something, and also we are likely to see this more at the micro level in terms of industries, large companies, enterprises, and so on. And that will be very healthy. Communities can start doing it when it comes to waste management. Already we are seeing...
Yeah, we're seeing, community initiatives, for example. They are doing their own bit, whether it's recycling or creating, alternative powers and so on.
Absolutely. And so on decommissioning, it's very, very critical that public, private, both domestic and international, as well as philanthropic contributions do come in.
Particularly in Southeast Asia, we mentioned that this is still very much, Indonesia is one of them, a developing country. We need to basically keep our growth up in order to, improve the welfare and the livelihood of the people. So there is this desire to have, if anything, energy demand will rise before it falls, certainly the next, decade. Now, let's go back to your first issue on cost, because if I'm not mistaken, it's going to cost the whole world, is it $17 trillion in order to finance energy transition? And for Indonesia herself, I think it would cost like 20 to 40 billion US dollars a year. Now, you being with the MDB, tell us a little bit about the, Indonesia has a country platform now, the ETM, Energy Transition Mechanism, and during the G20 we've received 20 billion in, commitments, and and JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership is, but it's just, at the moment is basically the proof is in the pudding, right? It's all about implementation. Tell us about some of the pathways to finance this and be achievable.
Cost is going to be high. So clearly, whether you look at an individual plant, individual investor level, or obviously if you zoom out, look at the economy level, and obviously given Indonesia's size and its share in the amongst the ASEAN economies, clearly the needs will also be, investment requirements will also be large. If you zoom out and look at the overall infrastructure financing requirements, we did an estimate a few years ago that was in the order of about, for ASEAN, climate adjusted figures, it was in the order of about $220 billion per year. And Indonesia was a huge chunk of that, again, given its size. Now there are new estimates available that increase it to up to $400 billion because if you're adding other ancillary infrastructure, logistics is an area that we had not looked at in depth earlier. So you're looking at massive sums of money. The global figures are in the trillions of dollars. For ASEAN, our estimates are in the order of about just over $50 billion in terms of phasing out coal or phasing out fossil fuel-based energy generation. That's only for the energy sector. If you're looking at urban mobility transition in terms of changing public utility vehicles, and then going for much more modernized, climate efficient like building systems, for instance, whether it's in public buildings or private sector, the needs are going to be very large. But just coming to the public sphere in terms of the investment requirements, they are in that order of order of magnitude of over 50 billion for ASEAN only. And then if you look at Asia and the Pacific, it's going to be considerably larger, right? Now, in the ETM context, as you mentioned, what is happening there? The pilot that was announced for Indonesia and Vietnam and Philippines included, we were initially looking at a plant as an average-sized coal-fired power plant, decommissioning coal phase out costing about $500 million. That was our estimate. Obviously, the exact details would vary depending on which plant you're looking at and what kind of, how early are you going to decommission. Now that's where the challenge comes in, which makes the cost higher because of the average age being so low. It's like 11 to 12, 15 years or so.
Plants, they last for like at least 25, 30
They're
years.
there, and the other issue that we need to look at in any country, not just in Indonesia, the private plants, which are the independent power producers, which are governed by legally binding power purchase agreements, they are definitive, say 40 years or so. The public sector plants, most of them or many of them may not have such PPAs because they are owned by state-owned enterprises in any country, not just in Indonesia. And because of that, you probably because of cost considerations and energy security considerations, these PPAs would be elastic. So that poses another challenge, particularly. Now, is it a short-term challenge or longer-term challenge? That we need to find out. So in the ETM context, what we have done is to look at the entire landscape of looking at all CFPPs, public, private, and aging analysis, and also the local landscape in terms of particularly from this energy security aspect and the equity aspect. What are the likely challenges? What are the opportunities? And what are the alternative costs? And the grid structure is also very, very important. Actually, one unique feature of Indonesia, which is probably, and which adds to the complexity, unlike say some of the other large economies like India, for instance, is that because of the natural resource advantage in Indonesia, bulk of power production has been coal-fired power. So in that context, unless you decommission existing coal plants by a significant margin, you cannot just invest in renewable energy because the grid won't take it. Whereas in contrast, look at India, for instance. India can keep increasing its renewable energy investments because the needs are considerably high. Investments have been happening, they've been evolving. So if you look at what India has accomplished in its renewable expansion, has been massive. In fact, they've already met the 2030 targets by 2021, not even 2022. In fact,
just through their own domestic efforts, right? Without
through domestic efforts, but these are investment
financing as well.
No, these are all investments going into renewable energy by public and private sources, which has been happening in Indonesia as well. Here we've invested in geothermal. ADB investments, but we've also supported other renewable energy transactions. But this is an important factor to keep in mind because coal decommissioning must happen by a significant margin before you can start ramping up renewable energy investments, and that's recognized. And that also is going to be a factor that we need to consider in terms of how long drawn out this process is going to be. And this public-private interface is going to be very, very critical as well.
If I'm not mistaken, Indonesia wants to phase out use of coal by 2040, Ramesh. But at the moment, our reliance on coal to power our energy is more than 60%. And that's really, really high. And our current energy mix for the renewables, it's less than, a lot less than 22%, actually. It's more like in the 12 and 13%. So I think that's going to be a huge challenge for Indonesia. Now, the other thing that you mentioned about the cost, so what is the best way to, get the financing to decommission these CFPP, these coal-fired power plants, especially with such long-term contracts? And the other thing is there's a lot of interest in renewables. Everybody wants to get into renewables, whether it's solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries. These are all really good things, but nobody seems to, I'm not touching coal, and I'm not going. Where will the money come from? Obviously, the Indonesian government doesn't have enough from its public coffers. And where do you think this is MDB such as ADB can actually help or become part of?
Yeah, the whole financing process, mechanisms, and so on. We've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of work, and in the JETP context, there have been a lot of discussions with both public and private institutions and countries, the G20 countries that have been involved in the process. And also, that this 210 to 400 billion spectrum that I mentioned, we had done sector-wise analysis, and including, for each country, for each sector and subsector, and so on. Now, clearly, renewables, a lot of money is waiting. In fact, we shouldn't be using the green terminology for green projects, but if you use a traffic light system, the low-hanging fruits, private sector will easily come in. Yep. So that part we don't need to worry about. In fact, the RE expansion, as long as the enabling environment is there, legal regulatory framework, institutional arrangements are there, and clarity in terms of what state-owned enterprises will do, PPAs and so on, I think that'll happen. That we are less worried about. Although there are technology considerations that we need to look at as well. For example, solar. Clearly very good for localized solutions, but the grid capacity and the transmission and distribution investments, particularly transmission investments, are very significant because losses need to be curtailed, kept in check. And if you're going into high voltage DC type of systems, they are expensive. The technology the generation side has become much cheaper. But the other ancillary infrastructure investment requirements that are needed are quite significant. So that needs to be taken into account. But keeping that for a moment on the renewable energy aside, on decommissioning, it's very, very critical that public, private, both domestic and international, as well as philanthropic contributions do come in. Otherwise,
like blended finance.
Through whatever innovative financing mechanisms, including blended financing, it is unrealistic to expect that a single country on its own will be able to meet the challenges. And particularly a country like Indonesia, given its own natural resources advantages, they are where they are. You can ask questions about why, but that is just shaped by a country's comparative advantage in terms of use of natural resources. So from that, and you can ask the same question about any of the other countries, right? Like, for example, certain countries that have moved ahead very fast in reforms, and in terms of if you look at...
Can you share us some of the best practices when it comes to...
Yeah, well, best practices, it really depends on what are the parameters that we are looking at with, right? For example, privatizing power, some countries have done. Philippines is a case in point. Indonesia actually gets grants with regard to technical assistance. So we've been providing, all the ETM work has been done through technical assistance.
Is that a good way of doing it, privatizing power?
Well, there are pros and cons. Clearly, in a large, this is where again energy security comes in.
Exactly,
right?
because in Indonesia, affordable energy is like a must. It's
very, very critical.
It's a national security issue.
Absolutely. Countries have evolved in terms of their public administration systems. Privatization has been the only way to go. The Philippines is a case in point. They've done very, very well. Now, if you look at Cambodia, another mid-sized economy, which is actually, it's a publicly owned utility model. But there, because of the fuel mix complexities, electricity prices tend to be high. There, renewable energy has been a big boon for them. But ADB had worked with Cambodia in solar auctions. Just before the pandemic, in fact, they netted the lowest negotiated tariff in ASEAN, 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour or so. At that time, it was the lowest. Now, coming to the successful experiences, clearly, again, you have pros and cons. But in Indonesia, there is a stock issue and a flow issue. So the stock issue is you're with what you have. So how do you change the composition of that as top priority? Now, the flow, we are very, very optimistic in terms of different types of renewable solutions coming in, the policy commitment being there, and I'll talk a little bit later about what positive impact it is going to lead to the change in the energy mix with regard to reaping trade potential or trade benefits through the global value chain, which has been the focus of discussions earlier today. Indonesia will be a huge gainer in the process. So I think that there are compelling reasons. But coming back to your question, who's going to bear the burden? I think it's going to be a combination. Clearly, there is a role for MDBs for ADB. This is a top commitment for us.
What do you commit?
Our commitment for for Asia and Pacific as a whole, we have considerably increased our climate ambition to achieve at least 100 billion by 2030. This is a cumulative financing commitment. Mitigation will be a large part of it.
So it is a form of grant, loan, soft loan?
This will be combination. This will be combination of concessional loans, and in some countries it will be grant funding. There are countries that are eligible for grant funding.
Is Indonesia one of them?
No, our grant or loan, concessional loan policy is driven by the per capita income of a country. So Indonesia, Indonesia has done.
What kind of interest rate was it? 5% or?
Oh no. Our lending is based on earlier the LIBOR, and now it's the SOFR-based interest rates. So now, obviously, the current global lending environment, because we are market-driven, right? But we are very, very competitive vis-a-vis the external sources of financing. The difference can be depending on the country, depending on times. By the way, you asked the question whether Indonesia will get grants. Indonesia actually gets grants with regard to technical assistance. So we've been providing all the ETM work has been done through technical assistance. For example, now for the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, we will be working very closely with the Secretariat through technical assistance as well as ADB staff inputs. Other areas such as technology dimensions are quite complex, and no single country can invest on its own, and we provide a lot of technical assistance support. So Indonesia will benefit from it. But overall, in terms of our large scale financing support for energy only, it will be in the form of creating an overall enabling environment, that is policy, legal, regulatory framework. To be concrete, for example, what can PLN do better, what can ME, MR can do better, and so on, and the overall kind of doing business environment. The second part is to affiliate ourselves very closely with what Indonesia is already doing. Our lessons learned over the last 55 years of engagement in Asia and Pacific is that go with support in areas where there is very strong country ownership. So for example, in largely power sector investments, PLN, MEMR, Ministry of Finance, they've had a very well coordinated investment program. We become a part of it. What we do is, in order to guide the investments, we come up with very clear indicators, development indicators to which our disbursements are linked, and we provide significant support. And the advantage for Indonesia is that it does not impose additional transaction costs of an external entity like us coming. because we are part of the the government's own government internally grown program that we support. And then finally, the third one is the investment projects. So, which is where, for example, the support for coal decommissioning for Cirebon or any of the other plants that we may identify, as well as new generation investments. Like, for example, just before the pandemic, we had invested in the Sarula geothermal plant. And we had done extensive technical assessments, and we are very optimistic that actually that space holds a lot of potential in terms of, because when it comes to generation, very clearly we will be going only for renewable sources or kind of technologically difficult cases like in geothermal.
So it is attractive for investors, particularly
Yes.
the private sector, to put their money in decommissioning coal-fired power plants.
Okay, so the private sector part of it, for example, Cirebon is a privately owned plant. Now, even for the private sector, what is needed is concessional money needs to come in, particularly grant funding needs to come in, because it is if you look at the the cost consideration, it's a trade-off. So, for example, let's say you catch a plant when it's got about 20 years to go. Then the question you'll be asking, okay, are we going to close it at age 35 or age 30 or age 28, age 25, right? So obviously the closer you come to the present, more expensive it is. So then that is exactly the process that we are doing. We've done various scenario assessments and what will be the cost. And here what is also important is the global developments in carbon pricing. That has been a kind of a slowly evolving science. But if that happens, and if we have, say, globally accepted benchmarks with country contexts coming in, that could be a very transparent way of pricing this process, and then we can invest. But just to come back, I think the concessionality is quite important. So what we've done since November last year, when at the G20, when the country platform was launched by the Minister of Finance. We have moved ahead. We are now building our grant contributions or the very highly concessional contributions that are coming in from various countries. So we have support which was committed by Japan even in COP26. And subsequently, we've been working very closely with countries like New Zealand, Germany, US, Canada. We are in discussions with UK and so on. A number of countries are interested. Our goalpost for the regional ETM facility, not just for Indonesia, that is including Philippines and Vietnam, was to assuming an investment requirement of $3.5 billion, because we had looked at about 6 to 7 plants, each plant costing $500 million. The grant money part of it to provide blended financing solutions was at least $500 million. So about 1/7 of the money. That we are actually making very good progress since last year. Many of these grant.
Is it still in the form of commitment, or
no? These are all very firm. These are all very firm commitments that have been made. And countries are now going through their own internal legislative processes. So it's no longer a discussion. It's actually, we are quite happy that it's been proceeding well. And last part, what I wanted to mention is on the role that global philanthropies play is also very, very important. So in that space, the government of Indonesia, as well as ourselves, and many of the G20 partners are working with the philanthropic entities that are putting in money. The GIAP Alliance has committed funding, a significant part of it. It's grant money. We are still in discussions, but for ETM is likely to be around about $25 million. It could be a bit larger. We are looking at building the book, so to say, to reach as much as possible a grant kitty, so that we will be in a comfortable place by for example, mid this year, and definitely before COP28. When we are talking about climate and climate investments, it's like saving for future generations. Now, we are creating this for future generations. In a way, it's like saving for our retirement.
I just want to get your thoughts on, and I know that Indonesia is also in competition with other Southeast Asian countries when it comes to, you know, trying to attract those investments. And I think financing energy transition, I think the bulk, the biggest of the share would be borne by private sector, obviously, because that's where the money is. And the governments, you know, they have very limited funds for all this now. How do you see Indonesia's attractiveness, and also, and how can, because the businesses, investors always say, you know, business climate, incentives, and rules and regulations, and, you know, making sure that, you know, at the end of the day, they do make profit out of it. Can you just give it like an overall view, particularly not just for Southeast Asia, but Indonesia, how attractive and what sort of the appetite, and what can Indonesia do? I mean, we've heard a lot of very positive noises, but in terms of actually trying, you know, implementing on those issues, how are we doing so far?
Yeah, you know, just on that last point, actually there is a lot of recognition that while the grid-related issues may be there, but very clear recognition that the composition has to change, and in that regard, the coal decommissioning, you know, should be happening, and in comparison,
but it has to happen, right? We can't really go forward without
it cannot be. No, it cannot be. Then it will result in the form of other trade-offs. You know, one issue that we have considered in this the global value chain study is that if the coal investments or not coal phase out does not happen, then clearly, for example, if things like the you know, the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism comes into play, then the end parties of the global value chain will be looking at, okay, how are the manufactured commodities that we are procuring from Indonesia or any other country produced, right? So there are implications. I think country is aware, PLN is aware. In fact, you know, we've been working with PLN for like 35 years or so. So a very strong commitment. I think on the private financing, clearly, which is going to be a big chunk of it, what is needed to be done by the government of Indonesia? As you said, it's that enabling overall policy and regulatory environment. I think, you know, clearly there is clarity needed always on coal phase out, you know, because investors, other partners, investors, they are all very clear, because business as usual cannot continue. So one coal plant cannot be replaced by another coal coming in. And, you know, there clearly that is a fair expectation or fair ask to have. But what we are also confident is that the cost involved in making that new coal from a you know, climate friendly point of view to meet the requirements, the cost is going to be multiple times larger than investing. So I think there are incentives that are building up which will convince any country to not go into new coal, but that commitment needs to be firmly in place. And then the
sorry, is the Indonesian government open to these?
These issues we've been discussing quite openly with them.
And you're optimistic that this will go?
No, we are quite optimistic. It is, you know, it is again, if you're looking at from the cost and security point of view, it's a trade-off, right? But I think overall we are quite confident that there is that commitment. It is going to be a process. We are, you know, once Cirebon picks up and the portfolio of plans that we've looked at, we believe that actually progress will pick up.
And we can phase out coal, you think, by 2040, you think? You know?
Well, a lot of things need to happen. A lot of things need to fall into place. But I think it'll happen, because I think, you know, it's no longer time is not in our hands. I think that recognition is there, and the global communities, investors recognize it. You know, institutions like us, until say a few years ago, for an institution like ADB. Anything to do with, you know, any compliance type of requirements, they're like the holy grail. You know, for example, land acquisition, resettlement, any negative adverse impacts of environment, they're like we have to meet them at any cost. You know, we spend a lot of time investing. Climate has become like that. In fact, I cannot imagine any project in ADB moving ahead to our board before climate considerations are met. In fact, you know, we've been using the terminology in Southeast Asia. We are calling it the 3M approach. The first is mainstream. You need to integrate climate into everything, anything and everything that we do.
Yeah, it's a complete change of mindset. I mean,
complete change of mindset. It's got to be transformational. It's actually, you know, not transition. It's got to be transformational.
Yeah, I mean, even down to what we eat, you know, because eating meat, for example,
Behavior.
meat is one of the largest emitters of, you know. So you have the mainstreaming, and then what's the other two?
Second M is mobilizing, because, you know, it's not just money. Climate transition is actually going to be technologically complex. Technology is expensive, but technology is changing very rapidly.
Yeah.
So every country needs to catch up. So it's mobilizing skills, knowledge, and creating that ecosystem. And the third M is messaging. So that is where taking to the message to people that, look, this must be done, and we've got to put money into it. You know, for example, within the 3% fiscal deficit, what is going to be in Indonesia, what is going to be the prioritization process in terms of money that I allocate for climate transition and energy transition? That is something policymakers have been going through, will be going through.
Yeah, they'll be allocating a lot of money for next year's election. We have this is sustainability also of policies. I think that's an important
and the you know, the short-term actions versus the medium and long-term benefits balance needs to be looked at as well, right? What I'm doing today, in a way, it's actually, you know, when we are talking about climate and climate investments, it's like saving for future generations. Now we are creating this for future generations. In a way, it's like saving for our retirement. You know, something to come. I'm not 30, but I'm 30 years old, right? I need to be saving when I'm 60. That's 30 years from now.
Now, just before I let you go, Ramesh, because, you know, you mentioned that the just and fair, or just and fair transition is important, you know, so that the most vulnerable will not be impacted. And when we talk about closing power plants, we're talking about people losing their jobs, areas losing their sources of income, and there has to be focus on, you know, the human resources, retraining them, and creating an ecosystem where everybody can take part in this brave new world of everything clean and renewable. What is the best way of doing it? I mean, you talk about, you know, security, you talk about equity. Give us a little bit more on the viable pathways, especially for this region where the gap, the social economic gap's very, very diverse.
Yes, yes. You actually captured it very nicely, Desi. In fact, all those dimensions are very important. Let me first focus at from a micro point of view. Like, you know, for example, the Cirebon plant that we are looking at and the portfolio that we've looked at in Indonesia. For each of these, we have looked at the local communities, employment profile, what is the local economy like, what will be the impact, for example, before you have alternative you know, sources coming in. And it's not just alternative sources, but it's retraining you know, these people to go into a completely probably different environment, and an environment where even if not from the core energy point of view may not be technologically advanced, in terms of operations point of view may be technologically advanced. So how do you prepare people? And then the affordability dimensions coming in. So we are doing that very careful mapping. In fact, we have a very well laid out just transition framework, and we cast it in the framework of what we are calling as 4P, which is policies, power, meaning the power system in terms of how in that local environment what the reshaped mix will be. And the third is partnerships. It is not just money that comes in, but it's also the local partnerships that we need to create. And the fourth one is the important dimension, people dimensions. So you know, if I just take 20 seconds out of energy and go into other areas, because, you know, obviously energy is super important, and particularly decarbonizing the energy industry is very, very critical. But actually decarbonizing many other sectors of the economy is going to be even more critical. Transport, for instance, you know, we've been working with the Jakarta City Administration and we are working in Metro Manila, in Davao City
I
in
mean,
the
EV
Philippines.
is now the household word.
EV is a household word as well.
Okay, and Southeast Asia is actually now the engine of growth for the whole world, right? So this is where actually the potential for growing and business potentials there.
Pathway
so
for
it should be
progress, absolutely.
attractive.
Pathway for progress and prosperity.
Yeah, and then it should attract all that money. But having said that, 2050 for Southeast Asia for net zero emission, is that, are you still optimistic?
Yes.
For
Yeah,
Southeast
it's going
Asia?
to, yes,
Okay.
yes. No, I think countries will, countries will be at, progress will be different. Country context will matter. This is subject to macroeconomic framework, the enabling policy environments continuing. We are optimistic because the commitment is being built up. From a macro perspective, Indonesia as well as the other countries have weathered crisis very well. Nobody can say anything about, in terms of 97 crisis, 2008 crisis, the pandemic, series of natural disasters. I'm not advocating only Indonesia. I'm talking about in terms of looking at it from an MDB perspective, Indonesia as well as other countries, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, all of them. The way the economic resilience has been achieved is phenomenal. Climate commitment clearly, and based on all aspects that we discussed, we are quite optimistic. I think there is a very clear recognition that decarbonization has to be development. Transformation is very critical. If we don't transform, our existence will be doubtful.
Yeah.
So I think that is clearly there.
Okay, Ramesh, thank you very much for your insight. It's been lovely talking to you, and then clearly it's good to end on an optimistic note, and we have to be optimistic because there's absolutely no alternative, right?
We are totally optimistic,
there
and
isn't,
we'll be.
well, maybe not for us. There isn't another planet that we can't, emigrate to.
We cannot go to. We cannot go to. This is the one planet that we have.
Yeah.
And the future we need to shape together.
Okay, once again, thank you so much, Ramesh.
Thank you.
Demikian Insight with Desi Anwar kali ini bersama Direktur Jenderal ADB Southeast Asia Department, Ramesh Subramaniam. Dan terima kasih atas perhatian Anda. Jangan lupa Anda juga dapat menyaksikan acara ini di cnnindonesia.com dan juga di YouTube CNN Indonesia Insight with Desi Anwar. Sekali lagi, terima kasih atas perhatiannya. Sampai jumpa. Take care. Bye-bye.